Welcome to Sustainability Soundbites, presented by E&E Leader, the chemical supplier that knows you can't walk away. A chemical market can be oversupplied while a buyer still has almost no leverage over the price of one critical input. The difference is whether another supplier can actually replace it. A procurement team receives notice that the price of a critical chemical is going up 12%. Normally, that starts a negotiation. The buyer checks market benchmarks, calls competing suppliers, and prepares an RFQ, and if the incumbent will not move, procurement has an alternative. But what if the chemical has been qualified into a manufacturing process for years? Changing it requires engineering approval or customer validation, and only two producers make the required grade, with the second already operating near capacity. Then a price increase stops behaving like an ordinary commodity negotiation. The supplier knows the buyer cannot easily leave. That distinction is becoming increasingly important in chemicals, where broad market weakness is coexisting with pockets of feedstock volatility, capacity constraints, and continued consolidation, and where recent market data shows chemical prices generally under pressure from weak demand and elevated inventories, even as energy and feedstock volatility remain the sector's clearest upside risk. For industrial buyers, that means the direction of the overall chemical market may say surprisingly little about the price of the one chemical they cannot replace. A weak chemical market can still produce a strong supplier. Benzene and related aromatics strengthened during July as renewed Middle East tensions pushed up crude-linked feedstock costs. Chinese benzene inventories remained unusually low, and refinery maintenance constrained availability. Caustic soda and soda ash, by contrast, remained comparatively subdued amid adequate supply and cautious industrial demand. A buyer negotiating caustic soda may therefore be operating in a completely different commercial environment from one purchasing a specialty additive or intermediate whose production depends on a constrained feedstock or a small number of facilities. Even within relatively standardized chemicals, localized production problems can move prices quickly. After an unplanned shutdown at Olin's Freeport, Texas facility, beginning in late December, depleted inventories, the company implemented an order control program, and U.S. caustic soda export prices climbed from roughly $330 to $415 per dry metric ton within about 6 weeks, prompting European buyers to explore Asian supply as the economics of imports shifted. A buyer with multiple approved sources can respond to that kind of disruption. A buyer without them has fewer options. Specialty chemicals create a different kind of switching cost. The problem becomes more complicated as chemicals become more specialized. A specialty chemical is often purchased for what it does inside a process, rather than simply for its chemical composition. It may determine adhesion, corrosion resistance, viscosity, conductivity, curing time, microbial control, or the performance of a finished product, which makes substitution more complicated than comparing specifications on two datasheets. A replacement can require laboratory testing, production trials, engineering approval, or customer qualification, and depending on the application, changing chemicals can also trigger environmental, worker safety, or waste management review, with the hurdles often higher still in regulated industries. That creates an economic advantage for the incumbent supplier. The greater the cost and time required to qualify an alternative, the less meaningful a nominal second source becomes. Procurement may technically have another supplier. Operationally, it may still be single-sourced, a substitution friction problem that mirrors what buyers are already confronting in other categories, where the underlying input doesn't have to be expensive to gain pricing power, only difficult or slow to replace. Consolidation can change the meaning of a second source. The ownership of chemical supply is changing as well. Global chemical M&A value increased 18% in 2025, according to Kearney, but 4 transactions represented 40% of total deal value, activity the firm characterized as portfolio reshaping and consolidation rather than a broad return to growth-driven deal-making. PwC reported in June that chemical sector capital is concentrating around specialty platforms and strategic carve-outs, with buyers particularly interested in coatings, advanced materials, and other differentiated businesses. In a market where deal value reached $67 billion on a trailing 12-month basis in the first quarter, across 552 transactions. In July, Solstice Advanced Materials agreed to acquire Element Solutions in a $14.5 billion transaction, combining Solstice's specialty material operations with Element's electronics chemicals business, one recent example among many of how portfolios in this sector are being reshaped. M&A does not automatically reduce competition, and individual transactions should not be treated as evidence of a supply problem, but continued consolidation raises an important procurement question. Are supposedly independent sources becoming economically connected? A buyer can have two approved products and discover that their manufacturers now share ownership, production infrastructure, or upstream dependencies, which means supplier diversification has to be evaluated at more than the product label level. The same due diligence gap already showing up in how consolidated ownership structures are complicating credit and risk analysis elsewhere. Feedstock volatility has more leverage when substitution is difficult. Limited substitution matters most when feedstock costs move. S&P Global's Materials Price Index peaked in 2026 at roughly 27% above end of 2025 levels, and even with prices subsiding through 2027, the index is expected to remain about 16% above its fourth quarter 2025 level by the end of that year, keeping energy, refined products, and other industrial materials as meaningful sources of ongoing supply risk. For a commodity buyer, an increase in one producer's cost can sometimes be challenged with competing market offers. For a specialty chemical buyer, the relevant question is whether another producer can supply the exact material at the required quality and volume within the necessary time frame. If the answer is no, feedstock inflation has a much clearer path downstream, and the supplier does not necessarily need any special mechanism forcing the buyer to accept the increase. It has commercial leverage because replacing the product is expensive. EHS can determine whether procurement has a real alternative. This is where the sourcing decision extends beyond procurement. An alternative chemical may be cheaper and commercially available while still being impractical to introduce. EHS teams may need to assess worker exposure, storage requirements, incompatibilities, emissions, wastewater impacts, waste classification, and emergency response procedures, and a formulation change can also affect permits or require updated safety documentation and training. That means alternative source development needs to happen before the supplier relationship becomes contentious, since waiting until a major increase arrives can leave procurement comparing a supplier's new price against the much larger cost of qualifying a replacement under pressure, a dynamic that echoes how upstream constraints are already forcing procurement teams to reassess risk long before a shortage becomes visible. The negotiation is no longer between $10 and $11 per kilogram. It is between paying $11 now and spending months determining whether the $10 alternative can safely and legally be used at all. The best time to qualify a second source is before you need it. For procurement leaders, the lesson is not that every specialty chemical needs two suppliers. Some volumes will not support it. Some materials have legitimate technical monopolies, and in other cases, maintaining dual qualification may cost more than the risk warrants. The decision should at least be explicit. Which chemicals would stop production if they disappeared? Which have only one qualified source? How long qualification of an alternative would take? Which require customer approval? Which substitutions would require EHS review? And where acquisitions may have changed the independence of supposedly separate suppliers. Those questions reveal something a traditional supplier list does not. A company can buy hundreds of chemicals and have meaningful competition for almost all of them. It only takes one critical material with no practical substitute to change the economics. And when that supplier raises its price, procurement discovers whether it actually had negotiating leverage. By then, building it may be too late. Interested in a Soundbite sponsorship? Contact our team to learn more. Thank you for listening.